morning sun cast long shadows across the Golden Valley Ranch as Sarah Mitchell stood on her front porch, holding yet another foreclosure notice in her trembling hands. The paper felt heavier than it should, weighted with the dreams of a life that seemed to be slipping away like sand through her fingers. 2 years had passed since her husband Tom's tragic accident, and every day since had been a battle she wasn't sure she could win. "Mama, is everything okay?" 8-year-old Emma's voice broke through Sarah's thoughts. Her daughter stood in the doorway, her blonde hair still messy from sleep, clutching her favorite stuffed horse. Behind her, 6-year-old Luke peeked out with those same bright blue eyes that reminded Sarah so painfully of Tom. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Sarah lied, quickly folding the notice and tucking it into her apron pocket. "Why don't you and Luke get dressed? We need to go into town today." She forced a smile, the same brave face she'd been wearing for months. Even as her world crumbled around her, the Golden Valley Ranch had been in Tom's family for 3 generations. Nestled in the heart of Colorado's high country, surrounded by snow-capped peaks and endless blue skies, it should have been paradise. The ranch sprawled across 500 acres of prime grazing land, with a main house that Tom had lovingly restored, red barns that had weathered countless storms, and pastures that once held the finest cattle in the county. But paradise had become a prison of debt and desperation. Sarah walked through the house that held so many memories, each room echoing with laughter that had long since faded. The kitchen, where Tom used to surprise her with breakfast on Sunday mornings, now felt too big, too empty. The living room, where they'd planned their future together, was now cluttered with unpaid bills and legal documents she barely understood. The numbers were brutal and unforgiving. $127,000 in outstanding mortgage payments, $43,000 in medical bills from Tom's final weeks in the hospital, $18,000 in property taxes, $12,000 in feed bills and veterinary costs for the remaining cattle. The ranch that had once been worth nearly $500,000 was now a millstone around her neck, dragging her deeper into financial ruin with each passing day. Sarah had tried everything. She'd sold most of the cattle, keeping only a small herd that barely generated enough income to buy groceries. She'd taken a part-time job at Miller's General Store in town, but the $12 an hour barely covered gas money for the 30-mile round trip. She'd applied for loans, grants, and assistance programs, only to be told repeatedly that she didn't qualify or that the waiting lists were years long. Mrs. Mitchell, banker Harold Whitman, had told her just last week, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "I understand your situation, but business is business. The bank has been more than patient. If you can't bring the account current by the end of the month, we'll have no choice but to proceed with foreclosure." The end of the month. That was 12 days away. As Sarah helped Emma and Luke get ready for their trip to town, she tried to push away the growing panic that threatened to overwhelm her. What would happen to her children if they lost the ranch? Where would they go? How could she explain to them that the only home they'd ever known was about to be taken away? "Mama, why do you look sad?" Luke asked as she helped him button his shirt. His innocent question nearly broke her heart. "I'm not sad, baby," she whispered, pulling him close. "Mama's just thinking about grown-up things. Nothing for you to worry about." But Luke was more perceptive than she gave him credit for. "Is it because of the mean man from the bank? I heard you crying last night." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She'd thought the children were asleep when she'd finally allowed herself to break down, sobbing quietly in the kitchen over a cup of cold coffee and a stack of bills she couldn't pay. The weight of trying to be strong for everyone was crushing her. The drive into Cedar Falls took them through some of the most beautiful country in Colorado. Rolling hills covered in golden aspen trees, crystal clear streams that sparkled in the morning light, and mountains that seemed to touch the sky. It was the kind of scenery that should have lifted spirits and inspired hope. Instead, it felt like a cruel reminder of everything Sarah was about to lose. Cedar Falls was a small town that time seemed to have forgotten. Main Street was lined with buildings from the 1800s, their wooden facades weathered but proud. Miller's General Store sat next to Murphy's Saloon, which had been serving cowboys and ranchers for over a century. The weekly farmers' market was set up in the town square, where local ranchers and farmers sold their goods to tourists and townspeople alike. Sarah parked their old pickup truck, a 2008 Ford that Tom had bought, used and kept running through sheer determination and prayer, and helped the children out. She had a few items to sell today. Some of her homemade preserves, fresh eggs from their remaining chickens, and a quilt she'd finished last week. It wouldn't be much money, but every dollar counted now as they walked toward the market. Sarah noticed the stares and whispered conversations that followed them. In a town of 3,000 people, everyone knew everyone else's business. They all knew about Tom's accident, about Sarah's struggles, about the foreclosure notice that had been posted in the legal section of the Cedar Falls Gazette. Some looks were sympathetic, others were judgmental, and a few were predatory local businessmen who were already circling like vultures, waiting to pick up pieces of the Golden Valley Ranch for pennies on the dollar. Sarah called out Martha Henderson, the elderly woman who ran the flower stand. "How are you holding up, dear?" "We're managing," Sarah replied with that same forced smile, taking it one day at a time. Martha's expression was kind but worried. "If there's anything I can do to help, ... Thank you, Martha. That means more than, you know." But Sarah knew that kind words and good intentions wouldn't save her ranch. She needed a miracle, and miracles seemed to be in short supply in Cedar Falls, Colorado. As she set up her small booth with Emma and Luke helping to arrange the preserves and eggs, Sarah tried to calculate how much money she might make today. Even if she sold everything, it would barely cover groceries for the week. The mountain of debt that threatened to bury her family seemed insurmountable, a peak too high and too steep for a single mother to climb. What Sarah didn't know was that across the market square, a pair of steel-gray eyes were watching her every move. Jake Mountain Morrison stood in the shadows of Murphy's Saloon, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee, studying the woman who had unknowingly captured his attention. He'd heard the talk around town about the Mitchell widow and her troubles, but seeing her struggle firsthand stirred something in his chest that he'd thought was long dead. Jake was a man who kept to himself, who trusted his horses more than people, and who had built walls around his heart higher than the Rocky Mountains themselves. But watching Sarah Mitchell try to hold her family together with nothing but determination and love was about to change everything he thought he knew about himself. Jake Morrison had been watching Sarah Mitchell for 3 weeks now, though she had no idea. Every Saturday when she came to the farmer's market, he found himself drawn to the town square like iron filings to a magnet. He told himself it was coincidence that he just happened to be in town for supplies on market days. But deep down, he knew better. Standing 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, Jake was an imposing figure even by Colorado standards. His dark hair was always slightly too long, his jaw perpetually covered with stubble, and his steel-gray eyes held secrets that most people were afraid to ask about. At 35, he'd spent the last 15 years living alone in a cabin high in the Rockies, emerging only when necessary to conduct business or trade horses. The townspeople called him Mountain Morrison, partly because of where he lived, but mostly because he was as solid, unmovable, and mysterious as the peaks themselves. He had a reputation for being able to gentle the wildest horses, for knowing every trail and hidden valley in a 100-mile radius, and for having more money than anyone suspected. What they didn't know was that Jake's fortune came not from horses or cattle, but from a brilliant mind for land investment and a trust fund he'd never touched until he was ready to disappear from the world. "You're staring again," observed Murphy, the grizzled owner of the saloon where Jake nursed his coffee. Murphy had been serving drinks in Cedar Falls for 40 years and had seen every kind of man walk through his doors. That widow's got you. Twisted up something fierce. Jake's jaw tightened. Don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. Murphy chuckled, wiping down a glass with practiced ease. I've seen that look before. Man starts thinking about things he swore he'd never think about again. Jake didn't respond, but his eyes remained fixed on Sarah as she helped her daughter arrange jars of preserves on their small table. There was something about the way she moved, graceful despite her exhaustion, gentle despite her obvious stress, that reminded him of the wild horses he worked with. Beautiful, proud creatures that had been broken by circumstances beyond their control, but still fought to survive. He'd done his research, of course. Jake Morrison didn't make any move without understanding all the variables. He knew about Tom Mitchell's accident, a freak storm that had spooked the cattle, leading to a stampede that caught Tom in the wrong place at the wrong time. He knew about the medical bills that had drained their savings, the mortgage payments that had fallen behind, the foreclosure notice that was posted in the legal section of the paper. More importantly, he knew about the Golden Valley Ranch itself. 500 acres of prime grazing land, water rights that were worth a fortune in drought-prone Colorado, and a location that would be perfect for the horse breeding operation he'd been planning for years. The ranch was worth at least $400,000 in the current market. Probably more to the right buyer, but it wasn't the land that drew him to the market square every Saturday. It was the woman who was about to lose it. Mama, can we get some candy? Luke's voice carried across the square as he tugged on Sarah's worn denim jacket. Not today, sweetheart, Sarah replied, her voice gentle but firm. Maybe next week. Jake watched as the boy's face fell, then brightened again when his sister whispered something in his ear. The resilience of children never ceased to amaze him. They could adapt to almost anything, find joy in the smallest moments, forgive the harshest circumstances. It was a quality he'd lost somewhere along the way. She's a good mother, Murphy observed, following Jake's gaze. Those kids are lucky to have her. Yeah, Jake murmured, remembering his own childhood and the motherhood. Tried her best before the cancer took her when he was 12. They are, of course. Being a good mother don't pay the bills. Word is the bank's gonna foreclose by month's end. Jake's hands tightened around his coffee cup. He'd heard the same rumors, had seen Harold Whitman circling the ranch like a buzzard. The banker was already making plans to sell the land to developers who wanted to build vacation homes for wealthy Denver residents. It would be a crime to break up a working ranch that had been in the same family for 3 generations. Shame to see a place like that get carved up, Murphy continued, his voice carefully neutral. Tom Mitchell's grandfather built that ranch. From nothing, blood, sweat, and dreams, you know. Jake knew. He'd built his own life the same way, though his dreams had been darker, more solitary. After his mother's death, he'd been shuffled between relatives who saw him as a burden, a reminder of tragedy they'd rather forget. By 18, he'd inherited a substantial trust fund and used it to disappear into the mountains, building a life where he didn't have to depend on anyone or risk losing anyone again, but watching Sarah Mitchell fight to save her family's legacy was awakening something in him that he'd thought was permanently buried. Maybe it was the way she held her head high despite the whispers and stares. Maybe it was the fierce protectiveness he saw in her eyes when she looked at her children. Or maybe it was simply that he recognized a fellow survivor, someone who understood that life could knock you down but couldn't keep you there unless you let it. I heard she's been looking for work, Murphy said, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. Might be willing to consider unconventional arrangements. Jake shot him a warning look. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing improper, Murphy said, quickly. Just that desperate people sometimes make desperate choices, and sometimes those choices work out better than anyone expects. Across the square, Sarah was packing up her unsold items. She'd managed to sell about half her preserves and most of the eggs, but Jake could see the disappointment in her shoulders as she counted the small stack of bills in her hand. $27, maybe 30. Enough for groceries for a few days, but nowhere near enough to save a ranch. "Mama, are we going home now?" Emma asked, her young voice carrying a weariness that no 8-year-old should possess. "Yes, sweetheart. Help me load these back in the truck." Jake made a decision that surprised even him. Setting down his coffee cup, he stepped out of the saloons shadows and walked across the square with the purposeful stride of a man who'd made up his mind about something important. "Mrs. Mitchell." Sarah looked up, startled. She'd seen the mountain man around town before. Everyone had, but he'd never spoken to her. Up close, he was even more imposing than she'd imagined, but there was something in his eyes that wasn't threatening, something that looked almost protective. "Yes," she replied, instinctively moving closer to her children. "I'm Jake Morrison. I was wondering if I could have a word with you about your ranch." Sarah's heart sank. Another vulture, probably. Another person who wanted to profit from her family's misfortune. "If you're looking to buy land, Mr. Morrison, I'm afraid you'll need to speak with the bank. They'll be handling the sale soon enough." "That's not exactly what I had in mind," Jake said, his voice low and rough like gravel. "What I'm proposing is different." Something in his tone made Sarah pause. This wasn't the voice of a predator or an opportunist. This was the voice of a man who was about to say something that would change both their lives forever. "Different how?" she asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. Jake looked at her children, then back at her face. When he spoke, his words were quiet but clear, carrying across the market square like a promise or a threat, depending on how you heard them. "You'll be my bride, and I'll save your ranch." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down in the dust of an old Western showdown. Sarah stared at Jake Morrison, certain she'd misheard him. Around them, the farmer's market continued its lazy Saturday rhythm, vendors calling out prices, children laughing, the distant sound of horses nickering in the livery stable. But, for Sarah, the world had suddenly gone silent, except for the thundering of her own heartbeat. "I'm sorry. What did you just say?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake's steel-gray eyes never wavered from hers. "You heard me correctly, Mrs. Mitchell. I'm proposing marriage. A business arrangement that would solve both our problems." "Both our problems?" Sarah's voice rose slightly, causing Emma and Luke to look up from where they were loading jars back into boxes. "I wasn't aware you had any problems, Mr. Morrison." "Everyone has problems," Jake replied evenly. "Mine just happen to be different from yours." Sarah glanced around the market square, acutely aware that their conversation was beginning to draw attention. Mrs. Henderson had stopped arranging her flowers and was openly staring. The Jameson brothers, who ran the hardware store, had paused their discussion of feed prices to listen. In a town the size of Cedar Falls, a conversation between the reclusive mountain man and the struggling widow would be front-page news by Monday morning. "Children," Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled, "why don't you go look at Mrs. Henderson's flowers? Stay where I can see you." Emma and Luke exchanged glances, but obediently wandered toward the flower stand, leaving Sarah alone with the most confusing and terrifying proposition she'd ever received. "Mr. Morrison," she began, trying to keep her voice steady, "I don't know what kind of woman you think I am, but I think you're a woman who's about to lose everything she holds." Dear Jake interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "I think you're a mother who would do anything to protect her children, and I think you're smart enough to recognize an opportunity when you hear one." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "An opportunity? You're talking about marriage, not a business deal? Why can't it be both?" The simple question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd been raised to believe in love, in romance, in the idea that marriage was a sacred bond between two people who couldn't imagine life without each other. She and Tom had been childhood sweethearts, had married for love, and built a life based on shared dreams and genuine affection. The idea of marrying for money, for convenience, for anything other than love, felt like a betrayal of everything she'd believed in. But then she thought about the foreclosure notice in her pocket, about the fear in her children's eyes when they thought she wasn't looking, about the very real possibility that they'd be homeless in less than 2 weeks. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, hating herself for even considering it. Jake seemed to relax slightly, as if her willingness to listen was the first hurdle cleared. A marriage of convenience. Legal, but not personal. You and your children would live at the ranch, which I would purchase and put in your name. In exchange, you would help me with a business venture I've been planning. What kind of business? Venture. Horse breeding. I've been looking for the right property to start a operation breeding and training cutting horses. Your ranch has everything I need. Good grazing, water rights, existing facilities. But I need someone who understands ranch life, someone who can handle the day-to-day operations while I focus on the horses. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. "And you think I'm qualified for that? You've been running the Golden Valley Ranch for 2 years under impossible circumstances. You've kept cattle alive, maintained the property, and raised 2 children while dealing with grief and financial pressure that would have broken most people. Yes, Mrs. Mitchell, I think you're more than qualified." Despite herself, Sarah felt a flutter of pride at his words. It had been so long since anyone had acknowledged her efforts, had seen her as capable rather than pitiable. "What would you get out of this arrangement?" she asked suspiciously. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "A partner. Someone I can trust to help build something worthwhile, and maybe—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Maybe a chance to be part of something bigger than myself." There was something in his voice, a loneliness that Sarah recognized because she'd been living with it herself for 2 years. But loneliness wasn't enough reason to marry a stranger, no matter how desperate her circumstances. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your offer. But marriage is a serious commitment. I have children to think about. I can't just—" "The children would be provided for," Jake said quickly. "College funds, healthcare, everything they need. And if the arrangement doesn't work out, the ranch would remain in your name. You'd never have to worry about losing it again." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. The security he was offering was everything she'd been praying for, everything she'd been fighting to achieve on her own. "But the price, I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course, but Mrs. Mitchell, Jake's voice was gentle but urgent. "Time is something you don't have much of. The foreclosure is scheduled for 2 weeks from Monday. If you're going to consider this, we need to move quickly." Sarah nodded, her mind reeling. 2 weeks to decide whether to marry a man she barely knew, to enter into an arrangement that went against everything she'd believed about love and marriage. 2 weeks to choose between her principles and her children's future. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked. Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "My lawyer's information. Call him. Have him explain exactly what I'm proposing, what protections would be in place for you and your children. I'm not asking you to take my word for anything." Sarah took the card with trembling fingers. "And if I say no, then you say no. I'll respect your decision and never bother you again. And if I say yes—" Jake's expression softened slightly. "Then we save your ranch, build a business together, and give your children the security they deserve. It might not be the fairy tale you dreamed of, Mrs. Mitchell, but it would be real, and sometimes real is better than perfect." As Sarah watched him walk away, his tall figure disappearing into the crowd of market-goers, she realized that Jake Morrison had just offered her something she'd thought was impossible: hope. It came with strings attached, with complications she couldn't even begin to imagine, but it was hope nonetheless. The question now was whether she was brave enough or desperate enough to take it. The 2 weeks that followed Jake Morrison's proposal were the longest of Sarah's life. She'd called his lawyer, a distinguished man named Robert Chen, who practiced in Denver, and had been shocked by the thoroughness of the arrangement Jake had outlined. The contract was more generous than she'd dared hope. The ranch would be purchased outright and transferred to her name, with Jake retaining only partnership rights in the horse breeding operation. College funds would be established for Emma and Luke, healthcare would be provided, and if the marriage ended for any reason, Sarah would retain full ownership of the property. This is highly unusual, Mr. Chen had told her during their phone conversation. In 30 years of practice, I've never seen a prenuptial agreement quite like this. Your Mr. Morrison is either very generous or very smart. He's not my Mr. Morrison, Sarah had protested, but the words felt strange in her mouth. Perhaps not yet, the lawyer had replied with what sounded like amusement. But Mrs. Mitchell, I feel obligated to tell you that this arrangement is extraordinarily favorable to you. If you're having doubts about Mr. Morrison's character, I can assure you that I've represented him for several years, and he's a man of his word. Now, sitting in her kitchen on the morning of the foreclosure deadline, Sarah stared at the unsigned contract spread across her table. In 3 hours, Harold Whitman would arrive with the sheriff to officially seize the property. In 3 hours, everything her family had built would belong to the bank, unless she signed the papers that would make her Jake Morrison's wife. Mama. Emma appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas. Are we really going to lose the house today? Sarah's heart clenched. Despite her efforts to shield them, the children knew what was happening. They'd heard the phone calls, seen the legal documents, felt the tension that had filled their home for weeks. I don't know, sweetheart, Sarah said honestly, but whatever happens, we'll face it together. Luke joined his sister in the doorway, his 6-year-old face serious beyond his years. Is the mountain man really going to marry you? Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. Where did you hear that? Mrs. Henderson told Mrs. Murphy at the store, Emma said matter-of-factly. She said he asked you to marry him so he could save our ranch. Small towns, Sarah thought with a mixture of exasperation and affection. No secrets, no privacy, but also no shortage of people who cared about your business. Would that be okay with you? Sarah asked carefully. If I married Mr. Morrison. The children exchanged one of those wordless communications that siblings share. Finally, Emma spoke for both of them. We want to stay here, Mama. This is our home, and if Mr. Morrison can help us keep it. She shrugged with the pragmatism of a child who'd learned too young that life wasn't always fair. He has horses, Luke added, as if this settled the matter entirely. Sarah laughed despite herself. Yes, he does have horses. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Sarah's heart jumped, thinking it might be the sheriff arriving early, but when she opened the door, she found Jake Morrison standing on her porch. He was dressed more formally than she'd ever seen him. Clean jeans, a pressed shirt, boots that had been polished to a shine. In his hands, he held a small bouquet of wildflowers. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, his voice unusually formal. I wanted to give you these before. Well, before you made your decision. Sarah took the flowers, surprised by the gesture. They were simple Indian paintbrush, columbines, and wild roses, but they'd been carefully chosen and arranged. Thank you. They're beautiful. I picked them from the meadow above my cabin, Jake said. I thought you should know that I don't take this lightly. What I'm asking of you, what we're both considering, it's not just a business arrangement to me. Sarah studied his face, seeing something there she hadn't noticed before. Vulnerability, maybe, hope, certainly, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine affection. Mr. Morrison, Jake, he corrected gently. If we're going to do this, I'd like you to call me Jake. Jake, Sarah repeated, testing the name. I need you to understand something. I loved my husband. I loved him with everything I had, and part of me always will. I can't promise you the kind of marriage that I'm not asking for that," Jake interrupted. "I'm asking for a chance to build something good together, to give your children the life they deserve, to maybe find out if two people who've been hurt by life can help each other heal." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "And if we can't, if this doesn't work, then we'll have tried, and your children will still have their home, their security, their future. That's worth the risk, isn't it?" Before Sarah could answer, the sound of vehicles approaching made them both turn. Harold Whitman's black sedan was pulling into the driveway, followed by the sheriff's patrol car. The banker emerged from his vehicle with a satisfied smile, clearly expecting to complete the foreclosure without any last-minute complications. "Mrs. Mitchell," Whitman called out, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I'm sorry it's come to this, but business is business. If you'll just gather your personal belongings, we can make this as painless as possible." Jake stepped forward, his imposing frame blocking Whitman's path to the door. "Actually, Mr. Whitman, there's been a change in circumstances." The banker's smile faltered. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" "Jake Morrison. And as of this morning, I'm Mrs. Mitchell's husband." Sarah's breath caught. Jake was claiming they were already married, giving her an out if she wanted to take it. All she had to do was contradict him, and the foreclosure would proceed as planned. Or she could trust this man who'd offered her hope when she'd had none. "Is this true, Mrs. Mitchell?" the sheriff asked, his voice kind but official. Sarah looked at Jake, seeing the quiet strength in his eyes, the promise of protection and partnership. She thought of her children, of the home they loved, of the future that hung in the balance, and she made her choice. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, it's true. Jake and I were married this morning." The lie felt strange on her tongue, but Jake squeezed her hand gently, and somehow it felt less like a lie and more like a promise they were making to each other. Whitman's face turned red. "This is highly irregular. I'll need to see documentation, which you'll have by end of business today," Jake said calmly, "along with the cashier's check for the full amount owed on the mortgage. I believe that concludes your business here, gentlemen." As the banker and sheriff drove away, defeated and frustrated, Sarah turned to Jake with wonder in her eyes. "We're really doing this?" she asked. "If you'll have me," Jake replied. "I know it's not conventional, and I know it's not what you dreamed of when you were a little girl. But Sarah, I think we could be good for each other. I think we could build something real." Sarah looked at her children, who were watching from the window with excitement and hope in their faces. She looked at the ranch that had been saved, at the man who'd made it possible, at the future that was suddenly bright with possibility. "Yes," she said, and this time it wasn't a lie. It was a leap of faith, a choice to believe in second chances and unexpected love. "Yes, Jake Morrison, I'll marry you." And as he pulled her into his arms for their first kiss, gentle, tentative, full of promise, Sarah realized that sometimes the best love stories don't begin with passion. Sometimes they begin with hope, with two broken people choosing to heal together, with the courage to believe that happy endings can come in the most unexpected forms. The Golden Valley Ranch was saved, but more than that, two hearts that had given up on love were about to discover that sometimes the most beautiful relationships are built not on fairy tale romance, but on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the gradual, precious growth of genuine affection.